everyone, welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shawwalker, your host, and today we're going to be checking out this new King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard album, Omnium Gatherum. So King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard are back again. It seems that the ever-prolific approach these guys have to releases has once again yielded an album that is usually unfocused, sometimes beautiful, often bloated, occasionally catchy, and still generally lacking in ideas. King Gizzard at this point are 20 albums into their catalog, and that's within a span of 12 years for all of those, and in the last 5 there's been 12 albums. And I get being a prolific band, there's plenty of artists who have put out a massive amount of work, like Frank Zappa, David Bowie, and Buckethead. But I think the biggest issue with that comparison is that there's few moments where those other artists have sounded like they're running out of ideas. Omnium Gatherum is kind of a touch on a lot of the sounds that King Gizzard has dipped their toes into over the course of their very long discography, with some exceptions like the sounds off of Microtonal Banana or Murder of the Universe. So it usually tends to revisit the blander avenues of psych rock and desert rock that don't really bring much new to the table. And there's not really much experimentation here, it's kind of just an audio experience that I would liken to banging your head into a wall to try and appreciate the acoustics of the drywall. And it's not like there's only bad material on this thing, but this album is long in both overall runtime and track listing, which makes the abundance of filler that much more long-winded. The first track on this album is a grueling 18-minute psych rock jam that cycles the same beat for minutes on end, and this isn't really building tension either. This is kind of just a time sink. The dripping tap goes nowhere over its runtime, and frankly is one of the weakest songs that the band has put out recently, purely from a standpoint of it being a total slog. It's like this track is King Gizzard, specifically at their most jam-heavy, and I don't really mean that in a good way. And the song actually does have like an okay intro segment, and very quickly sort of breaks down into this extreme test of patience about like 3 minutes into the track or so. And even if you were to take this track and compress it, trim out what's unnecessary, and just kind of present the most solid of the ideas, what would be left wouldn't feel like much more than a demo. At its base, this really feels like there was a very basic, bland idea that was stretched so far as to become completely meaningless. At the very least, though, the album does recover after that huge intro track with Magenta Mountain, a track that I really think would have been a much wiser choice for an album opener. This is one of the few worthwhile songs on the album, despite it being a bit of a Tame Impala ripoff. And even with this song being a drastic improvement over the dripping tap, there's still a very obvious lack of focus that the song has, with a very lax, meandering beat that doesn't seem to really develop past its very psych-heavy motif. Past Magenta Mountain, what you'll get are short tracks that vary from modern takes on psych, disco, and trance styles. Most of these songs are usually forgettable. Kepler 22B is a prime example of a track that is so generally bland as to be memorable only in name. And it makes sense that a band like King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard would have a really good grasp of song naming, leading to some really sick song titles. I mean, really every track here has a title that's loaded with imagery, but when you actually listen to these songs, it's kind of just a total letdown when you realize that there's not much else going for these tracks past a clever title most of the time. There's a little bit of a revisit to the sound off of Infest the Rat's Nest on Gaia. I personally found that album to be initially kind of cool as a concept, but it very quickly becomes a really grating listen, so this song ended up having kind of a similar effect. It's like they took all of the worst parts of classic heavy metal and blended them with the worst of noise rock. This track has a bland, repetitive set of lyrics, a bridge that's barely passable, a verse section that leans far too heavily into chugging, galloping riffs, constantly building tension but not leading to any kind of release other than an incredibly underwhelming drum solo, and to call it a solo would be very generous. This is very much a glorified drum fill. Ambergris is another of these somewhat worthwhile tracks here. There's a cool blend of funk and psych. I'm also feeling like some jazz notes on this one. I like the chunky bass lines, I like the smooth vocals, and the lyrics are okay, nothing to really write home about, but still, they capture a really neat vibe for this song. And it really is a shame that this album lacks a lot of direction, because if this album was like half as long as it is with with tracks that were similar, or at least on a similar wave to Ambergris, this would be a much more cohesive listen and generally less of a chore. Sadie Sorceress is a bit of a hideous continuation of the theme of the last track with this kind of Beastie Boys style funky rap section. There's some sample work here that's not particularly good. The backing track sounds like it was thrown together haphazardly to somewhat resemble a classic hip-hop beat, but it's been really twisted and fused with some awful organ parts. I don't really know what the intent of this track is. I don't know why this is on this album. It's a bad song, and I really have nothing good to say about it. I have some similar thoughts on the next track, Evilest Man, though this track is not a rap track. There's still more of these weird, dancey melodies and rhythms that are juxtaposed very, very uncomfortably, pretty much as uncomfortably as possible. There are moments where this song kind of works, though, mostly in transitory moments where the song is between segments, but past that, this track also has a bit of an issue like the Dripping Tap in that it is way too long. Realistically, you could cut this at the 3-minute mark and have a song that is weird but okay. The second half of this track cuts into a noise rock style that feels very tacked on to the end. The Garden Goblin is another track that feels like it's proving my point that this album is mostly filler. I mean, this feels like a late era Ween track in how whimsical it is, but it doesn't really feel nearly as endearing. If there's one thing that I'm pretty sick of at this point, it's King Gizzard trying to pump out these whack, fantastical tracks. It's just plainly overdone, and thematically it's shallow. There's not enough solid songwriting here to support these styles of songs. My opinion on that continues into Blame It on the Weather, probably one of my least favorite tracks on the album. At the very least, though, this track is mercifully only 2.5 minutes long, but I don't get why this track is here. It's obnoxious and it's doing the same backflip that King Gizzard seems to nail every time. Initially, this noise, desert, psych thing worked really well, but like I said earlier, this album is kind of a culmination of all of the past ideas King Gizzard has had, just drawn and quartered. I mean, completely stretched as far as possible. At the very least, there's another pacer track in here with the very aptly named song Persistence. This is another really solid moment on this album. The chorus is catchy, the beat is simple but effective. This is quickly trampled over by the Grim Reaper. This revisits the not very well thought through rap style again, but with a little bit more tact. It's still a very lukewarm track, but it's weird that they would try this sound more than once, especially considering the utter fumble that is Sadie Sorceress. Presumptuous is one of the few tracks that tries to blend some more of the funk and Motown styles that actually kind of works, and that's mostly because this track is very stripped back compared to a lot of the other songs. It's a little bit more in line with Ambergris or Persistence. Predator X once again rehashes the heavy sound from Infest the Rat's Nest. Just like the last example of this sound, the production is thin, the writing is bland, and the track has a problem with the idea of going anywhere or, God forbid, having a point to make. At the very least, there is kind of a semi-decent guitar solo on this track. It's not really mind-blowing, but it does almost rip right off of the song Perihelion off of Infest the Rat's Nest. From this point, the album actually takes a pretty dramatic upturn. Thankfully, they pull it together for the end, and they end things on a relatively high note. Red Smoke, Candles, and The Funeral are actually pretty strong tracks. Red Smoke has a very cool Doors style that feels pretty natural. This track also feels a lot more full and a lot more fleshed out than a lot of the previous songs. Candles is a pretty similar story, very similar vibe with more of a jazz fusion element. There's some clever uses of polyrhythms here in the beat. I like what I think is a mellotron or maybe a vibraphone on this song. It's a really cool, very pleasant track. The final song, The Funeral, doesn't really send the album out with a bang, but it does at least feel like a solid nod to the people who made it to the end. And for such a mixed bag, this feels like a pretty appropriate way to top off this album. Like I said at the beginning of this review, this album is a bit of a rehash on a lot of the sounds that made this band huge. But even still, most of the writing ends up going in circles or drops off right in the middle of what you thought was a point that was trying to be made. I think there's some okay material on this album, but a lot of what's here easily should not have been put out, and many of these ideas conflict at a very basic level. I would call the attempt admirable if the final results weren't so generally easy to pan. I really think this album should have been a 20-minute EP. There was not 80 minutes of material here. I'm feeling a pretty firm 3 on this one. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of the album in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe and check out my Instagram, my Reverb store, and my Depop. Links to those are in the description below. And thank you all so much again, and we'll see you on the flip side.